Okay, so got a lesson here on the French Revolution. Before I get started here, a couple of things. Did everybody get that document turned in? French Revolution, you got that turned in? Okay. Secondly, does everybody know how we got here? Like where we came from and how we got to this point in history? So by that I mean, starting with the scientific revolution, you understand how it sort of evolved into this. Does anybody have any questions over that? Nothing? Okay, so I've said some of this stuff to you before, and so if I repeat myself, just humor me. But you've the analogy I always use here is sort of the Rocky Four analogy, and I think I've said that to you guys before. Of the scene where Apollo Creed's been killed by the Russian. Rocky decides he's going to fight the Russian, and his wife says, you can't win, and he says, maybe I can't win, but to beat me, he's going to have to kill me. And to do that, he's going to have the courage to stand in front of me. And to do that, he has to be willing to die himself. So the question I was asked, and the reason I use that analogy is, what would it take for something to rise to that level for you? Because we're talking about massive numbers of people here. What would it take for something to be that serious that you'd be willing to, metaphorically speaking, push all your chips to the center of the table and risk it all? Pay the ultimate sacrifice. Like, what would that take? Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. People who've decided that it's worth the risk for whatever reason. Now, having said that, it's generally not, if for something to rise to that level, it's not one thing. There's a combination of things going on all at once that create those circumstances. And look, I want to be clear before we talk about this. Like, I'm not advocating violence. Okay. Violence is contrary to stability, which is contrary to the status quo, which means things go badly for everyone. Okay. Having said that, though, I'm going to read to you from a National Geographic story and sort of relate something here to, and we've mentioned this before, to current events. It says, pulling down statues, it's a tradition that dates back to the U.S. at war for independence. Fireworks, bands, and cookouts are essential ingredients of any 4th of July celebration. What's usually not on the menu is toppling statues, ripping down signs, or burning portraits. But in the days following the new nation's Declaration of Independence, Americans went on a frenzy of destruction that makes today's attacks on Confederate and other symbols of white supremacy pale by comparison. The most dramatic act took place in New York City on July 9, 1776. Early that evening, General George Washington and his troops, along with hundreds of citizens, crowded in what is now City Hall Park to hear a reading of the document that had just arrived from Philadelphia. The enthusiastic throng then headed for Broadway and the 2-ton equestrian statue of King George III on Bowling Green. 2 tons. Big statue. This was the same route protesters took in 1776 when New Yorkers demonstrated against the Stamp Act, taxing a host of goods. The following year, the colony's assembly commissioned the statue to recognize the king's support for repealing the taxes. Modeled on the classical equestrian sculpture of Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, it arrived from London in 1770 and was erected with great pomp and circumstance. John Adams paid a visit to New York in 1774, and he wrote to his wife, "The king's statue is, quote, very large, of solid lead, gilded with gold, standing on a pedestal of very high marble." 2 years later, fervent New Yorkers, with the help of Washington's soldiers, quickly pulled it from its place and broke it down into pieces. Much of the lead was shipped to Connecticut and melted down into 42,000 musket balls that were subsequently used in the Revolution. Okay. The U.S. Postmaster General wrote, "The statue has been, quote, pulled down to make musket balls of, so that his troops will probably have melted majesty fired at them." Okay. Now, it should be noted that Washington was appalled by this and told his men never to take part in anything like that ever again. Okay, so I do want to throw that in there as well. Okay, of course they're held to a higher standard. You're talking about soldiers, right? Not just common people. So this, my point being, I've often said this, and I get it. People, obey the law, stop breaking stuff. Well, guys, if we obeyed the law and didn't break stuff, we wouldn't be here. I'm trying to make sure you guys understand that. There is a moment, and I'm not here to play and tell you when that moment is, when people are so sick of a system that they rebel. And as was noted by Danton in the video, revolutions aren't made from rose water. The question is, when is that moment? Is it justified? How do you justify it? Okay, and how do you choose to look at an event? Is my point. So as we look at the French Revolution, like what are the details that are involved here? You heard about a lot of this stuff on the video, so I should be able to move through it fairly quickly. So what are the elements at play here that cause people that are willing to lay their lives on the line? Well, the first thing I want to go back to is all those ideals of the Enlightenment that we already discussed. That's A. You have these ideals that begin right around 1740, and they run right up and through the Revolution, 1776, and they're all coming out at once. So that's A. That's part A. Part B is a political problem, a governmental problem. Now, the Estates General. We have talked about the Estates General before, but you probably don't remember. It was, remember the nation states worksheet? Okay, the Estates General was formed to give the third estate a seat at the table, to give commoners a seat at the table. Okay? At the time, in the 1200s, now late 1400s, it's a really good idea. Okay? Now, that idea has run its course. Now, what is the problem? So we talk about an estate as a social class. Okay? At the time, France is broken up into three estates. First estate is the clergy, and they're made up of about 1.5% of they're made up of about 0.5% of the population. They control 10% of the land, they pay no taxes. Okay? Second estate, the nobility, makes up another 1.5% of the population. They control about 30% of the wealth, and they pay no taxes, or what's called the tally. That's what you see that up there under the first estate. Okay? They hold all positions of power in the military, government, and the courts. And the third estate are the commoners. They make up the other 98% of the population. Okay? They pay about half their income in taxes. Now, to give you an idea, the average American pays about a quarter of their income in taxes, about 25%. Okay? Now, when you're talking about 98% of the population, certainly they're not all the same. So you have three subgroups here. You have peasants, feudalistic peasants, that make up about 75% of that figure. Feudalism's not dead yet, but it will be after the revolution. They all own all their feudal duties to the Lord. You had urban craftspeople, city dwellers. These are shopkeepers, workers. They're upset about the high price of consumer goods. So they're all upset for different reasons. Okay, the peasants are upset because of feudalism. The sans-culottes, group B, urban craftspeople, they're upset because things cost too much. They're upset about inflation. And then you have what we call the bourgeoisie. They are upset. These people are upper middle class. These are people who have money. They've been successful. They are bankers, doctors, lawyers. They are people of privilege. But what they're upset about is they have no privilege. They have no authority. They don't control anything. Okay, so it's sort of like, if I use this, there used to be back in the day, 100 years ago, they talked what they called old money and new money. Have you ever heard that expression before? Old money is money that's been passed down by generations. New money is you hit the lottery. You have an oil well in your backyard, right? You didn't really, in the eyes of old money, you didn't really do anything to earn it. You just got lucky. Okay? So think of it this way. You could be a multimillionaire, but you still ain't the Kennedys. Does that make sense to you? And you think, well, I wouldn't care. Yes, you would. It's all about what you think you deserve. If I owe you $20 and I only give you 10, you're going to be mad. Right? It's the same thing here. If I've been successful and I've made money and you don't let me have any say over my life, I'm going to be upset. Okay? So they're upset for that reason. So this system, and the reason it's a problem, is because of the way it works. So picture this. Let's say this class is the States General. We have three groups: first estate, second estate, third estate. One of you is the first estate, and you get a vote. Two of you, two others, you're the second estate. You get a vote. All the rest of you, you're the third estate, and you only get one vote. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a problem over time. And so because the first and second estate share so much in common, neither one pay taxes, they hold all positions of authority, they control the wealth, they tend to agree on everything and outvote the third estate 2-1. So the third estate's role in this becomes largely symbolic. Okay? So you have a potential political problem here on top of the ideas of the Enlightenment. Then we move on to a financial crisis, and I'm going to blow through this really quick. There's a food shortage. So the supply of food goes down. The population at the same time increases. So demand for food increases while the supply goes down. What does it do to the price? Drives it up, right? So we have rampant inflation. I'm not talking about a little bit. I'm talking about debilitating inflation. You heard in the video, at one point, it would cost the average French person an entire month's wages for one loaf of bread. You want to know how you get Adolf Hitler? During the Great Depression in Germany, it would cost $100 for a potato, a single potato. Okay, so we're talking about really, really dire economic situations here, coupled with rampant unemployment. People can't find work. Okay, as the monarchy continues to spend money like it grows on trees. And you see, this is not going in the right direction, right? And then you couple that with the American Revolution, where France dumped in a whole bunch of money to support our revolution, out of spite mainly, just because they lost the French and Indian War. And so you have ideas of the Enlightenment coupled with political turmoil, coupled with economic turmoil. This is not going to end well. I would submit to you, modern day, just as an example, this is my theory, I have no basis for this, but you have a small minority of our population that starts clamoring for revolution. I don't think that's going to happen as long as the stock market's good. You stand to lose too much. Yeah, I can't see too many people in middle class America that are living in $200,000 homes going, yeah, let's burn it all down. At the end of the day, I got a house, food on my table, a roof over my head, and heat, electricity, and an iPhone. The idea that I want to push all my chips to the table, even though I may disagree with the current administration, whatever that may be, I don't see too many people willing to risk it all if they feel like they got it all. At the end of the day, our economy's still good in our situation, right? Now, if the economy collapsed, people were unemployed, you have riots break out all the time during the Great Depression in major cities, right? So it's at the end of the day, in a current climate, that may be what's truly saving you from. You may have ideas, you may have principles you stand by, you may not be in favor of the way the government's constructed, but if this third element is in place, it tends to hold things together. Okay. Now, but in this situation in France, you have a powder keg. I mean, this whole thing's sitting on it just needs something to spark it. So what sparks it? Well, if the economy's bad, then we got to raise taxes. Okay, I mean, and we've talked about this before. Look, I'm not smart, but I do know there's only two ways to solve debt. You either find another source of revenue, or you cut spending, or some combination of the two, right? So, ironically enough, the French Revolution starts with taxes also, but it's different. In America, Americans don't want the British taxing them. In France, it's sort of funny. The third estate wants taxes. Now, they don't want to tax themselves because they're already being taxed. Who do you think the third estate wants to tax? Yeah, the first and second estate, who currently aren't paying anything. But the system, the way that it's constructed, is not going to allow for that. They're going to get outvoted 2-1. So representatives of the third estate go to Louis, and they say, change the way things are voted. Let's let's make it so every representative gets a vote instead of just one vote for each estate. If you do that, then the third estate will outnumber the other two, and we can change things. Well, Louis a member of the second estate, and he's wishy-washy, and they went through all the weak leadership things about Louis, right? So he's like, at the end of the day, he's persuaded by representatives of the first estate, and he's like, nah, leave it the way it is. So they get outvoted 2-1. It's at that point that the third estate walks out, goes across the street to the tennis court, takes what's called the tennis court oath. They swear that they are the new National Assembly. They are the legislative body of France. Now, they have nothing to back this up. It would be like me walking in here and telling you I'm the king of the world because I decided. Okay? But that's how this starts. We are now the new National Assembly. We are the legislative body of France. You must listen to us. Okay? Guys, heads up. All right. So then that takes us here. Okay. The triggering event, July 14th, 1789, the storming of the Bastille. Okay. So picture it's a hot July day. People are gathered out in the streets of Paris. Prices of bread are skyrocketing. They can't find food. They can't find stuff. And then they begin to hear that Louis has sent for foreign troops to seize control of the city. So they've had it, and they riot. Only they don't tear down a statue. They go right for the gusto. They go for a political prison called the Bastille, where they know there are huge stores of guns and gunpowder to defend themselves. Okay, in the way they're looking at it. So as they begin to break in, they kill some guards. Quite naturally, the guards in the prison fire back to defend themselves. Makes sense, right? On the outside, they are firing into a mass of people. And some of the French troops outside sort of come to the realization that, hey, that's my aunt, other uncle, brother, sister, cousin, mom, dad in the crowd. And so they start to shoot back. Now we have French troops fighting French troops. Okay, so think of it this way. Let's say you got up something and you were worked up and you decided you were going to storm the State House downtown. And while you were storming it, it got violent enough that the people inside started firing into the crowd to disperse the crowd. And then your brother, who's an IPD police officer, thought, I ain't having that, so to fire back at them to protect his brother. Right? It's not even about the cause. So this thing melts down really quick. And they get in, they get the guns, they impale some of the guards' heads on pipes, and they parade it through the town. It's a show of defiance on an extreme level. So again, what would it take to reach that point? I mean, that's how bad things have gotten. So that launches you into something called the Great Fear. Now, here's trying to recreate this emotion in you. Here's what the Great Fear is. If you've ever had your parents go out of town and they told you, and I'm not encouraging this, by the way, that don't have anyone over to the house. You guys got it? Don't have anybody? Yeah. And then you think, Friday night, you're kind of bored. If I have a couple people over, it's no big deal. My parents will never know. So you invite your best friends over. And then you're bored. About an hour later, you're all bored. So like, hey, well, we just ask a few more, but let's ask so-and-so and so. What are they doing on a Friday night? Saturday night. And so they come over. Next thing you know, you're all having a good time, eating, drinking Kool-Aid, being merry. Why do people always laugh when they say Kool-Aid? Don't you guys like Kool-Aid? Okay. And then you notice that the house is getting a little trashed. It's going to be hard to keep this a secret. But your friends tell you, don't worry, we'll help you clean it up. You wake up the next morning, you've had your good time, but the house is trashed, your friends are gone, and your parents are going to be home in a half an hour. Now, you know that feeling of anxiety that you have in that moment where my parents are going to kill me and there's no way out of this? That's the Great Fear. Okay? If you look at it here, these guys have their party at the Bastille. They feel good. We're defying the king. We're doing this. Stick it up your end. We're going to burn things down. And then the next morning, they wake up and they're like, holy crap, the king is going to get us for sure. right? So what are your choices? Well, any psychologist will tell you of two fear responses: fight or flight. Well, where are you going to run to? There's nowhere to run to, right? This is your home. So they decide, let's get them before they get us. So they burn down manor houses. They destroy legal documents. They tear down statues, pictures, right? They riot, mostly in the cities. Okay? And during this time, you get a new constitution written, what the French call the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It is almost word for word in places our Bill of Rights. Okay? All men are free and equal before the law. Public officials should be promoted based on talent, not birth. Everyone should be taxed, which is, again, somewhat ironic. The French Revolution starts because of taxes. They also reformed the church. This is lashing out at the first estate. Okay? We're going to make it a state-controlled church. So in other words, if you want to be a priest, you have to be an elected priest. And you're going to be paid by the government. As you can imagine, this offends some staunch Catholics. Okay? But all of this is to strip power away from the first and second estate. Now, real quickly here, I want to make sure you understand this. This right here, this little side note thing that I've written. There are actually 4 phases to the French Revolution. There's what we call the moderate phase. Moderate meaning it gets a little violent, but not terrible violent. So everything I've talked to you about so far would be in the moderate phase. Storming of the Bastille, the Great Fear, the new Constitution. Okay. Then there's what we call the radical phase. Like most people, if you do something and you're not successful at fixing the problem, you think you haven't done enough. So you want to go to another level. Okay? So when things don't get better economically, the radicals say, well, we need to do more. This is Maximilien Robespierre, the Reign of Terror, right up until Robespierre is executed. Okay? Then you enter into the reflective phase, which was not depicted a whole lot on the movie. They mentioned it right at the end. You have a committee of people that come in called the Directory after Robespierre has been killed, and they try to normalize things, but the economy still doesn't get better. And then you enter into the 4th phase, what we call the Napoleonic phase. Okay? We rioted, we broke the system, it didn't get better. We reflected, it still didn't get better. We want someone to save us. So Napoleon becomes this cult-like figure that people follow. So you've actually come full circle. You went from getting rid of the king to establishing a dictator. And we'll get into this later. When Napoleon enters onto the scene, they issue a plebiscite, which is just a yes-no vote. Do you or do you not want Napoleon to be emperor? 98% say yes. Now you understand you can't get 98% of people to agree the sky is blue. Right? So that is a significant, that's how desperate people are. Save us. Save us from ourselves. Okay? And that's where you enter into that. We've gone from monarch to emperor in full circle. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now, we're going to shut this down for today. Does anybody have any questions to this point? Yes, sir.
Do you think their life became better during the revolution, or should they just would have been better if it was not good? Like I understand the outcome.
The analogy I would use would be generally when you fix something, it gets worse before it gets better. I think that's kind of what happened here. The revolution has 2, depending on how you want to evaluate it. What did it do for France? And then what did it do for Western Europe in general? And I would say, that's kind of what they say at the end of the video. The stuff that you've seen going on, and I don't know how familiar you are with all of this, but the stuff that you've seen go on in Syria, Egypt, Tanzania, Russia later, all these different revolutions are all sort of a product of this time period. mankind, the average person like you and me, in a lot of places in the world has seized on their own destiny. Said we want authority to decide. So the long term, I think it got better from that perspective. But it's kind of like, I don't know. Did you watch The Mandalorian, a Netflix Star Wars thing?
Yeah, a little bit.
They make a comment because it takes place after Return of the Jedi. There's a couple of people that are like, bring back the Empire. At least when Darth Vader and the Emperor were in charge, things were stable and peaceful, right? And we sort of knew what was going on, and I benefited economically from the stability, right? But if you're watching the Star Wars movies purely from a freedom point of view, then it certainly gets better, but in the short run, it gets chaotic. So it's, my point that I've always tried to impart on you guys is democracy is fragile. Like I've had these conversations with my relatives where, gosh, guys, if things are as bad as you say they are, then our American way of life is already lost. I mean, that ship has sailed then. And if to get it back, you have to essentially give a person dictatorial authority. You guys know what ends up happening to Napoleon, right? He has a good run of it. And I would submit to you that his entering into the scene really radically changes the course of history. I indirectly think Napoleon is the cause of World War I. Indirectly. I don't think he meant to. but anyway, we'll press on. You're probably looking at a test Friday, possibly Monday, but I'm going to try and do Friday. Okay. All right. Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. I'm really not that funny, but oh well.